how did you manage to train AI to see the Russian propaganda?
We provide the subject matter expertise to begin with, and then we help the model identify what the experts are seeing. The idea that there is a satanic cabal of Ukrainian politicians is a pretty good one.
Kyle, who's paying for the job?
Who's paying for the job?
Yeah, I mean, you're not a nonprofit.
I don't see Russia targeting the US as much as it has in the past. I think what they do generally, which has been successful, unfortunately, in places like the US and the UK, they have already created self-sustaining systems of propaganda and disinformation.
Hello friends, it's KYIV Not Kiev, Changemakers season, a Ukrainian project created by the Truman team that aims at making Ukraine's communication with the world better, because where there is a lack of communication or it is not good enough, there is a space for disinformation, and Russia uses this space to fill it with its bullshit theories. My name is Tetiana Gaiduk, and today I'm talking to Kyle Walter, head of research and insights at Logically, the US-based tech company that combines artificial intelligence with expert intelligence to tackle potentially harmful online content. Kyle, I'm very happy to see you in KYIV Not Kiev. Thank you for joining me. Could you please tell me more about Logically? What distinguishes the company from the similar companies on the market? Are there similar companies in the market?
Sure, yeah. I think working on mis and disinformation is an industry that's kind of booming in a sense right now. There's obviously been quite a few opportunities in recent years in various spaces, in public health, in elections, in foreign influence, for mis and disinformation to take root and to have negative effects generally. Logically, as a company, is a tech company first and foremost, so we do work with machine learning, AI, to attempt to identify mis and disinformation, address and mitigate mis and disinformation, in combination with a team of analysts who work on open source material to do analysis, assessment, and again, try to help form mitigation for mis and disinformation, help address the issue which is currently growing in society.
Mm-hmm. Who do you work with? Who are the clients?
We work with a variety of people across spaces, in the national security sector, for example, with governments, with local, state level officials. We work in the private sector as well. We have various clients who require various things. I think that's the best way to kind of encapsulate it. Like I said, we work across public health, elections, foreign influence. Those are kind of the main areas that we address at the moment. So we've done things in relation to the US elections, for example. We've done things in relation to misinformation from a public health perspective. So we cover kind of a wide array of areas in the space.
Everyone is talking so much about the possibilities of artificial intelligence. You made AI work for you. What function does it perform in the analysis of harmful narratives?
Well, one of the key things that it does is it helps highlight potential narratives that can be investigated by analysts, right? It's the idea of making the job easier for an analyst so that they're not manually just grabbing information off the internet. It's kind of algorithmically highlighting information that may be being disseminated at a high level or may be deemed impactful in terms of its reach online. So it's kind of helping to auto-categorize those things for further research and investigation by analysts.
Mm-hmm. And what are the criteria? So how do you distinguish a potentially harmful narrative, misinformation, propaganda from the truth? And how did you manage to train AI to see the Russian propaganda?
Yeah, so the Russian propaganda element is a unique one. We do a lot of work in Russian language, which I think is obviously unique in terms of what Logically as a company does, particularly in this space. We are also not in Ukraine or Russia, which also makes it unique that we're doing Russian language work on the subject. And I think one of the key things that we do is we bring in subject matter experts, some people who understand the Russian information environment in this specific instance, who know what the biggest Russian Telegram channels are. They know where they can find the majority of disinformation and propaganda being disseminated from. And they helped to enable the tech to better identify these things by providing that initial subject matter expertise in the same way that a lot of the models that you'll see kind of, ChatGPT has been a big one recently, for example, where people are talking to it, you're getting automated responses. It's the idea that we provide the subject matter expertise to begin with, and then we help the model identify what the experts are seeing as potential lanes for mis and disinformation.
Mm-hmm. My friends and colleagues from the Ukrainian tech media spectra want to know, what sources did you use to train the algorithm, and what platforms do you work with?
So we work with a variety of platforms. I would say primarily, and this is something that we publish weekly, we track disinformation narratives across Telegram, VK, and Twitter. But we have our own threat intelligence platform called Logical Intelligence, which ingests data from millions of domains. So it's a lot of different social media platforms. It's not specifically for Russian propaganda and disinformation. It just happens that that's one of the language-enabled abilities of tracking content from VK, for example. So we track things kind of broadly. Like I said, it involves the tech. It involves manual elements as well. You know, something like on the Classic Key, we go on manually to track information that's happening there as well.
Mm-hmm. And how big is the team of researchers?
So we have about 200 people at the company overall, but the team working on investigations specifically is about 40 people total.
Mm-hmm. I see. Naturally, most of my questions will concern Ukraine, because I'm Ukrainian. We're recording this conversation on the anniversary of full-scale Russian invasion. Russia used a whole bunch of false pretexts to invade Ukraine. Which of them seem the most absurd to you?
Oh, the most absurd.
Yeah.
So many to pick from, right? The idea that there is a satanic cabal of Ukrainian politicians is a pretty good one. The idea that Volodymyr Zelensky, a Jewish man, is a Nazi, is also pretty good. I think the allegations about drug use and various claims around the zombie Ukrainian forces that are fighting in Bakhmut, for example. There's just so many different narratives that have been shared over the course of the year. And I think the key thing to highlight to people, which is I think more pressing now than ever, is that this is not just the last year, right? A lot of these narratives have existed about Ukraine for sometimes decades, and definitely particularly since 2014. So these are things that have been around in the information environment, that they didn't just crop up on the invasion, on February 24th last year. This is stuff that's been happening for a while. And I think it'll only continue to happen. Like a lot of these narratives, which we're talking about in a report that goes live today, are specifically related to Nazism, Satanism, and terrorism. And some of these things kind of crop up at different moments. The terrorism one particularly came up after Ukrainian forces struck the Kerch Bridge, and Russians were claiming that they were doing terrorism, which of course is ironic given the context of Russians bombing Ukrainian cities on a daily basis. But these are narratives that have gained in dissemination levels, meaning they've been shared more frequently in English language over the last year. And we looked at specifically the period from November of 2021 up until February of this year to see how much has changed in terms of the levels of online mentions of these specific narratives. And all three of them have increased, which is not necessarily surprising. We've got very prominent figures in American media on Twitter who are tweeting in English, who are making claims that Ukraine is a Nazi state, or asking why the United States government is funding a Nazi government in Ukraine, which is only helping to further share these disinformation narratives, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. KYIV NOT KIEV had also an ambassadorial season, the set of the interviews with foreign ambassadors to Ukraine. And that was my traditional question. What is the most stupid thing you've heard about Ukraine from Russian propaganda? And there were a lot of funny moments, like the Swedish ambassador Tobias Seberg said that the killer mosquitoes bred in Ukrainian biolabs is the most funny thing.
According to the Russian permanent representative of the United Nations, I don't know if it was Ukraine or maybe it was NATO, which was preparing an army of killer mosquitoes.
That actually, lots of them are more serious, like the Nazis thing, because the people who are not deep in the subject, they will never know that far-right parties in Ukraine were always so far from getting into the parliament that less than a percent of Ukrainian population support far-right movements, and Ukraine has nothing to do with the Nazi. But you're absolutely right. That's a narrative. It exists. It existed years ago when Russia was preparing its people for fighting with the West. the collective West, and it is present in the information space right now. So do you see that Russian messages are evolving? And if yes, what shift in messaging do you see?
Sure. Yeah, I think the most recent thing that's happened has been in the last few weeks. Obviously, Putin gave a speech. What was that, on Monday of this week? And a lot of the rhetoric has become more serious, I would say, from a Russian perspective, in terms of the sacrifices that the Russian state's going to need to make, the Russian people are going to need to make. Definitely echoing World War II significantly, echoing things like Stalingrad significantly, painting Russian forces as the liberator like they were in World War II. And again, just really harping on the fact that Russian people are going to need to make sacrifices for Russia to be victorious in the war in Ukraine has been a huge message. And it's not necessarily surprising either. The effects of sanctions have obviously been seen in Russia. They've become somewhat cut off from certain elements of Western goods, of Western economic interests in terms of oil and gas. So they have in some ways become more isolated. The people have definitely had to deal with that reality. And the Russian government, in order to maintain the support of the Russians who support the war in Ukraine, need to effectively message to them that this is a righteous cause, that this is something that they need to do, and that their sacrifice won't be worth nothing. So I think that's been the key element. The existential threat of the West and NATO has also been played up significantly. The idea that, the West won't stop until Russia's destroyed, which is something that Lavrov and a few other people who are officials within the Russian government came out and said in recent weeks. Lavrov even compared Russophobia to the Holocaust. There have been many moments like that in recent weeks where Russian officials have come out and effectively, played the victim and said that they are actually the ones who are in trouble here. They're the ones that are under threat. And it's the imperial colonial West who is trying to destroy Russia, who, they of course claim that they don't have their own imperial and colonial legacy. But even outside of Ukraine, you can look to the North Caucasus, you can look to Central Asia, you can look to Siberia, you can look to really anywhere outside of Moscow, St. Petersburg, and see legacies of imperialism, see legacies of colonialism. It's one of the more ironic moments, I think, of the last year, is that someone like Ramzan Kadyrov is a huge supporter of Putin, and you have Chechen forces, the Kadyrovsi, fighting in Ukraine against other Chechens at times who have been fighting on behalf of Ukraine for very obvious reasons, right? The Chechens have fought 2 wars just within the last 3 decades against Russia. And so the notion that Russia is not an imperialist state or not a colonial actor is in some ways playing off of a lack of Western knowledge of Russian history.
Most of the messages that you described earlier, they are targeting the internal audience, the Russians. So to explain that this is a holy war because they need an explanation to death as poverty and the need to endure hardship for a long time. What about the other audience, the foreign one, the countries that are allies of Ukraine or who still are hesitating to manifest their support publicly? What does Russia have to them?
Yeah, I think the big thing for people who are supporting Ukraine is Russia typically will message the potential escalation, right? They focus on the threat of nuclear weapons, the threat of escalating the conflict further, essentially in response to either aid being provided or aid being discussed. We've obviously seen it recently with discussion around tanks and planes and whether or not that would happen. The tanks have been agreed to, the planes may still be agreed to, but they focus pretty predominantly on trying to strike fear into the West, to be frank. That's the main goal here. It's the idea of threatening the safety and security of the world.
As for the escalation, I heard a very interesting thought. Last week, I talked to Dame Melinda Simmons, British ambassador to Ukraine, and I asked, my colleague Polina and I asked her about the fear of escalation and why some Western allies are hesitating in providing Ukraine with the necessary weapons. And her answer was,
do you know, there's a part of me that thinks we are collectively beyond the point of worrying about escalation. I mean, the threats have been coming all the way through since since the beginning, frankly, and certainly since Putin saw that we were inclined as allied countries to help Ukraine militarily, he's been making these threats. And it's hard to see where they've actually materialized since we have been stepping up and giving exactly the sort of kit that he has been specifically saying, if you do this, this is going to happen, and then this hasn't happened. So I think there probably is a growing and quite healthy skepticism among countries about that threat, which doesn't mean you don't take it seriously, but that perhaps it's being considered as less of a percentage in the equation of what you give.
And I think that that's representative of really every element, of the war in Ukraine at the moment, right? Whether it's the Minsk agreements or whether it was the Budapest memorandum, it's historically speaking, Russia has said many things and done the opposite.
What are the Russian messages designed especially for the United States?
I think a big part of it actually comes down to the aid, right? And we've seen the effects of that in the United States recently, where Congress people have gotten together to put proposals on the floor to discuss ending aid to Ukraine, right? So Russia will put narratives out specifically, again, about Nazism, about Satanism, kind of the same overall themes. Some of them resonate in the US more because of, like the highly religious community, for example. When you hear that there's a satanic sect running Ukraine, naturally that's something that you say, oh, well, I wouldn't like that very much, so we should probably not support that. And I think the other key thing to remember about the American information environment, let's say, is that a lot of people are very peripheral actors and observers when it comes to Ukraine. They're not particularly invested. They're not particularly paying a lot of attention to what's going on. They're more concerned domestically with whether we have issues domestically, whether we're funding anybody, frankly. And so it's very easy to provide divisive narratives in that sense, to kind of essentially take what is large support for Ukraine in the US, but focusing on the fringe elements who are not particularly supportive of Ukraine and who are very easily convinced to, in some cases, even support Russia outright.
The US declares unwavering support for Ukraine as long as it takes to protect itself from Russia. Last week, President Biden arrived in Kyiv to express his support to the Ukrainians in person. You also pay a lot of your professional attention to monitoring elections and the messages that influence the elections. What changes is Russia waiting for in American politics? And who does Russia target with its messages? And maybe the last question in this row will be, to what extent do you think Russia will be able to succeed in influencing the American audience?
Yeah, so I'll take the first question and then kind of go from there. I think from my personal perspective, I don't see Russia targeting the US as much as it has in the past. I think what they do generally, which has been successful, unfortunately, in places like the US and the UK, they have already created self-sustaining systems of propaganda and disinformation. So there are already people in the US who are happy to share Russian propaganda and disinformation, who are happy to disseminate it further. So there's not as much of an active effort necessary. And I think in some ways, strategically, Russia has moved beyond the US. They're not particularly concerned with who's the president now, who's the president in 4 years. They're more concerned with how do they deal with the situation right now, because in some ways, Russia's played their cards, right? They've made the decision to further invade Ukraine. They've made the decision to take on the burden of sanctions. And so in a lot of ways, their decision-making doesn't seem like it's going to change anytime soon, because they've already made the big leap to engage in this war, which they themselves call war with NATO, right? They frame this as if it's a broader conflict already, even though it's not. So in some ways, it seems as if they're preparing for that. So I don't think they're as concerned with American politics as they may have been in 2016, for example, when in their minds, they were trying to preempt what they ultimately ended up doing last year.
Let's go back to your work. How much attention and working time you and your team devote to work on Ukraine? On Russian war in Ukraine and the Russian propaganda that is an integral part of this war.
So we dedicate quite a bit of time. I personally dedicate a lot of time as well. My background is working on Russia, specifically on kind of the space surrounding Russia. And I've been doing that for about a decade at this point in terms of my studies and research that I've been doing. And so I spend a lot of time particularly focusing on this area. There are also people in the team who are very passionate about this subject who spend a lot of time working on the area as well. But I think really what we do as a company is highlighted by the war in Ukraine, but it's also just a general thing that we address, right? So the idea of disinformation broadly is kind of something that takes up all of our days, realistically. And so it happens that right now, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a massive source of disinformation. And it's a huge focus of the work that we do as a team and as an organization.
Kyle, who's paying for the job?
Who's paying for the job?
Yeah, I mean, you're not a nonprofit. And of course, I understand that you can volunteer to help the world deal with Russian disinformation. But as a part of a communication team of Truman, I, of course, understand that there must be clients who wants to make their decisions based on knowledge what's going on in the world. And that's why you perform your job.
I won't go into the specifics of who exactly we work with in terms of clientele, but I will say that there are elements, right, that are driven by the fact that we do generate revenue from doing this work, but there's also elements like the work that I particularly do personally, but also in combination with the work that I do logically, which in some ways is driven by the necessity to do good generally. It's not necessarily tied to strictly making a profit, right? It's the idea that we are addressing something that's harmful. And yes, it is a business ultimately at the end of the day, but it is something that we all care very deeply about in terms of addressing the problem and trying to mitigate.
I respect this approach much.
Thank you.
How do you communicate the results of your investigations?
So typically we'll publish them on our website. So when we've conducted an investigation or conducted a report, either analytically or as an investigation, we'll publish that ourselves. We engage with the press as well in terms of providing any insights that we have on Russian propaganda and disinformation, and also just broadly when it comes to mis and disinformation on the whole. So I'd say those are the primary ways that we communicate it, and then we also use our social media channels as well.
Let's tell everyone how we met. I saw you on TikTok because you have a TikTok.
Hey everybody, I'm a researcher working on Russian propaganda and disinformation. Let's take a look at this week's Russian disinformation narratives. I've been featured here,
Talking people in TikTok about disinformation. So actually, no, the first time I saw you was your comment in the New York Times, I believe. And after that, I was among those targeted by your TikTok video. Does this mean that you target Ukrainian audience as well?
I think the goal is just to have as many people see the content as possible. And I really appreciate the feedback that I get from Ukrainians that watch the TikToks as well, because the goal is not to avoid criticism or to avoid people, fighting in the comments section, let's say. The goal is to expose the content to Russians, to Ukrainians, to people in the West who may not be paying as much attention as they could be. So it's really a broad audience, I would say, of people who are watching the content. There's not really a specific target audience. It's mostly just trying to get as many eyes on it as possible so that people can hopefully learn something, or that I can provide some sort of insight into what's been going on for a very long time now.
I saw your recent investigation on Russian and Russia-backed activity in Africa. That's about the so-called Russosphere network. Can you please tell me briefly what you managed to dig up? What messages does Russia spread in African countries?
Sure, yeah. So I'll start with the messaging aspect. They share the narratives that I was touching on earlier, the kind of anti-colonial narratives, the idea that the West has a legacy of doing bad things in Africa, which again is a legitimate grievance, but they're using it as a weapon to position Russia better strategically looking forward. So a lot of what's done is saying that Russia would be a better partner economically and for security reasons if they were to engage with African nations. And this specific network that we identified was tied back to actually the founder of the Eurasian Observatory for Democracy and Elections, which you'll probably be familiar with, was brought in to oversee the referendums in Crimea and Donbass in 2014. And so, of course, that was a big moment, I would say, when we discovered that this kind of cross-platform network was connected to an organization like the EOD, because they have, of course, been involved in even doing things like these referendums in Ukraine, but they've also been involved in running propaganda and disinformation throughout Africa.
You've mentioned earlier that Logical is about to release the piece on the anniversary of the full-scale war unleashed by Russia. What will be in it?
Or yeah, I mean, so really we just wanted to look at how Russian narratives about Ukraine have been disseminated in English language. So we looked at what I consider to be kind of the three primary narratives about Ukraine: that Ukraine is a Nazi state, that Ukraine is a satanic state, and that Ukraine is a terrorist state. These are kind of three main claims that get made regularly by Russia. And we looked at how the levels of dissemination and sharing have changed since 2021, prior to the war, well, prior to the expanded invasion, I should say, and up until February of this year. So there was an expected massive uptick in the amount of online mentions of these narratives. All three of them have increased significantly. It's interesting to see, the Nazism narrative, for example, has increased, but not as much as the Satanism narrative has. These narratives are being disseminated more in English language. We touched on it earlier. They're being disseminated by influential accounts, by people who have a big audience. And they will likely continue to have a high level of dissemination because Russia is effective at messaging propaganda and disinformation.
What can we do to counter Russian efforts in disinformation?
I think the key is just highlighting good information. It's what I try to do in the TikToks I make. It's what we do as a company generally. It's the idea of providing all of the available information for people so that they can see what the real story is. So I think explaining that to people and making the broader context available of, how long these narratives have been in the information environment, what ways they've shared these narratives to try to get people to listen and to buy into them. And what the actual story is about what's taking place, and particularly the effect that it's having on the Ukrainian people is also a key thing to highlight, right? One of the biggest things that I try to do is talk about the real world impact of these narratives, and logically, obviously, as well as very focused on the real world impact of these different narratives that take place online. And as we've seen, probably most explicitly through the expanded invasion of Ukraine, it's a real world example of how narratives about a people or a country can be turned into a violent war of aggression. And hundreds of thousands of people can be affected, and people can die and be displaced purely off of rhetoric and off of narratives being shared about a people in a country.
Well, good luck to both of us in fighting Russian propaganda, in debunking myths, and in doing our best to counter propaganda and disinformation. Kyle, I thank you very much for spending this morning with me in KYIV NOT KIEV. These were Tetiana Gaiduk and Kyle Walter, head of research and insights at Logically. Kyle, thank you.
Thank you, Tetiana.
So stay safe and let's celebrate future victory of Ukraine together.
For sure. You as well.